Welcome to the Anthro Art Podcast, a space of anthropological insight connected to real-life situations. Here we explore topics of social inequality and inclusion, sustainability, and the social self. We aim to bring a more nuanced understanding of our world and its challenges, but also inspiration and ideas on how to solve them together. We hope you enjoy it.
Rethinking Landscapes, Ecological Relations in More Than Human Collectives as a Way to Think About the Anthropocene. In this essay, I wish to discuss the ways in which food systems can be a valuable tool to think about biodiversity as inherently interconnected with our human worlds, in practices that look towards the sustainability of ecosystems, rather than based in the logic of extracting resources without caring for the degradation of landscapes. I argue that through an ethnographic looking glass, attuned to the complex relationships that abound from inhabiting an ecosystem on planet Earth, with regards to specific food systems based in local ecological knowledge and practice, like the extensive agro-pastoralist systems in mountain areas, we can understand the ways in which certain food production systems can in fact help us think and act on the current socio-ecological crisis. For this discussion, I draw on my own fieldwork among agro-pastoralists in the northeastern region of Portugal, done during September 2023 and January 2024, in the context of a research project, Pastoral Praxis. Based on a mixed methods approach, my fieldwork's main method was walking with shepherds of indigenous sheep and goat species along their daily grazing paths, allowing informal conversations to happen based on ethnographic inquiry into the human-environment relations. In anthropology, my research field, we call this type of method participant observation, i.e., a way to learn about people's lives aiming at a deep look into the way they think, act, and deal with the world around them. The perspectives brought from this experience are of enormous value as they point to possible avenues for change in face of land degradation, biodiversity loss, and impacts of climate change. Growing environmental degradation provoked by climate change and specific human activities is impacting communities everywhere in the world, and it becomes increasingly relevant to understand the social and ecological dynamics behind such processes. In the academic debates on this topic, some authors argue that a new term is even needed for the current geological epoch of human domination and impact in the Earth's systems. The term, brought to the academic discourse by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stromer in the year 2000, is the Anthropocene, and, as you might have heard, it aims at drawing the attention to the impact of humanity in the ecosystems around us, explaining the actual footprint that our species has left in this planet. However, a few problems arise when facing with this concept in its original sense. In one way, the idea that humans are inherently bad in their actions towards the world results in confusion and a certain degree of apathy that affects us all, especially when we face the amount of degradation of natural habitats, species extinctions, wildfires, chemical infiltration on soil and water, and so many other effects that have become increasingly aware in the last decades. In another line of thought, thinking that this is a problem inherent to some type of universal human nature that depends on an extractivist look towards the ecosystem leaves out a huge amount of social systems and practices, like traditional pastoralist societies, that are based in a sustainable resource management perspective. The northernest region of Portugal, besides having faced considerable changes in the last century, still reflects the traditional ecological knowledge of pastoralists, as it happens in other mountain regions in the world. Faced with several socio-ecological challenges that affect their livelihoods and ecosystems, their lives and perspectives are of great importance and should not be overlooked. Although different views on the current ecological impact on Earth are in debate, the main argument lies in the fact that the habitability of several ecosystems are in serious risk. The term Anthropocene tries to show that by representing, as Stefan has said, the quantitative shift in the relations between humans and the global environment. This shift, some authors argue, was brought about by specific factors in parallel with great capital accumulation projects. Behind this perspective emerges the understanding that the current hegemonic ways of dealing with natural ecosystems cannot continue. That we need to look towards the natural cycles around us and find ways to interact with such cycles that allow us for the continuation of the relationships that let us live on this planet. Agricultural and pastoral practices are a perfect way to think about it. The idea of earthy relationships, initiated by the anthropologist Amelia Moore, can be helpful to understand that behind landscapes, in this case agrarian and pastoral ones, lie different interconnections between animals, microscopic organisms, and humans in ways that allow us for life to continue. The agro-pastoralist systems in the northeast region of Portugal integrates indigenous vegetation and agrarian landscapes in practices that maintain a connection with memorial times. Lameiros, a specific time of pastures that lay beside the little creeks in the mountains, surrounded by trees, are a perfect example of this integration. They represent a mixture of autochthonous vegetation, indigenous to the region, with different strains of seeded plants that have become naturalized with these pastures. Lameiros allow the production of hay for the herd's winter fodder and are also used as good quality pasture during different parts of the year. During my own fieldwork in this region, I noticed shepherds looked at some of these fields as changed landscapes, somewhat abandoned. This means, they explained, that fields are abandoned by pastoralists that used to bring their animals here, and then other type of vegetation, like bushes, suppress the inhabiting plants that invade the pastures. This in turn raises the risk of wildfires, as the vegetation is not eaten by ruminant animals. Another interesting thing happens in the process. These type of pastures are home to different indigenous plants and now run the risk of extinction. This made me think about the ways certain plants and ecosystems are actually dependent on human practices that in turn depend on them. An example can be explained by using three such species. By reading the red list of vernacular flora in continental Portugal, one finds a lot of species of plants unique to this territory that run the risk of extinction. Rumex longifolius, also known as lavastra comprida, is a plant indigenous to the northern of the Iberia Peninsula. It faces the risk of extinction precisely, as the red list says, because the abandonment of traditional pastoral practices in the region, which has been facing mass depopulation since the 1960s. Another plant, Viola bubani, faces the same danger, mainly influenced by the loss of habitats maintained by traditional pastoral practices, like lameiros. In the case of chestnut groves, called sotus, one of the main agricultural incomes that people in this region depend on, and also an important pasture resource for the pastoralists, there is a plant that grows in it that also faces extinction. Its name is Cephalanthera rubra, also known as Arbolina rosada, and its main challenges are the mobilization of soils by tractor and the use of pesticides in chestnut groves. In fact, this is also an obstacle for pastoralists as pesticides are dangerous for the animals that feed on the plants sprayed by it. Besides, tractors in this process came in to substitute ruminants in the management of vegetation that grows between the trees. In light of these examples, we already see how the intensification of agricultural practices, coupled with abandonment of rural areas, exacerbates the problem of extinction and affects the continuation of traditional practices that are based on sustainable resource management. The abandonment of such areas, then, can be the engine for the extinction of many plant species that rely on the practices of humans and animals that share those same landscapes. It also allows us to think about how food is produced, in what conditions, and based with what type of practices and human-environment relations. We should, I argue, be aware that the effects of different food production systems have on natural cycles and species around them. The problem, in turn, is not what we eat, but how it grows, in what conditions, and what are the effects and relations it sustains. In light of these reflections, I don't intend to propose a romantic view on human-animal-plant relations, or some type of naive look towards what it means to grow food for the whole world. What I wish to underline is the necessity to look at the relationships established in that process. The way we grow food in an industrial complex type of system, based in the plantation model, the use of dangerous chemicals, and the exploration of human labor, needs to be rethought. I do not, as well, want to defend a romantic view of the past when I talk about the traditional agro-pastoralist practices. Nonetheless, it is most relevant to understand the value of local ecological practice that, even if always in reconstruction and negotiation, are based in interactions and relationships of humans and their local environment that span for generations. Life processes in different species are inherently connected with the transformations of landscapes, and in turn, this process is concerned with various political, social, and ecological dynamics. By looking at the relations that emerge in these processes, we can also tune our attention to destructive formats that put at risk the continuity of the rich array of human and non-human collectives that permeate the landscape of our world. Relations between biodiversity and inhabited places of the past, as scholar Susana Matos Viegas has said, are important to think on the processes, world visions, and practices that in turn support life on Earth. To overcome the action crisis that currently afflicts those of us that are aware of the sustainability problems of the present, I argue to the need to look on the different spatial and temporal scales, to history but also to life beneath our feet, living in the soil, and the relations that allow us for the continuation of biodiversity and the reconstruction of habitable landscapes. Historical processes of landscape change are an interesting place to start, as they speak to the ways in which ecosystems are directly related to our daily habits, like having dinner or breakfast, or even a beer. Try to think about the next thing you eat as having its own historical life, directly connected to some specific ecosystems, and I guarantee you will find some interesting human story. The capacity for ethnography to find these stories is incredible, and my own experience with the pastoralists of Trás-os-Montes, Portugal, was an invaluable step in my own questioning of the food production systems that feed us. I ask that you make the same questions in your daily life and think about how can we change the ways food is grown and valued in a manner that allow for biodiversity, and even depending on it. The term Anthropocene is definitely important to create awareness to the current ecological crisis, although it must not make us reproduce the idea that humanity is inherently a plague. Like the anthropologist Paulo Godinho has said, the moments of rupture with the vivid reality evoke the experience to deal with the new. In this sense, reflecting on our food systems can be a valuable step to think about the past as a resource for the future, and a relevant tool to act in face of massive species loss, landscape degradation, and the exploration of human lives.